Mike walked into that courtroom wearing his best suit, the same charcoal gray one he'd worn to our wedding 4 years ago. He sat down across from me, adjusted his tie, and leaned over to his lawyer with this smug little smile. Then he looked directly at me and mouthed 3 words that made my blood freeze. "I want everything." I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the man I'd once loved, and whispered back 4 words that would change his life forever. "Good luck with that." Mike thought he'd calculated every angle, thought he knew exactly how this divorce would play out. What he didn't know was that his lies had already written his ending, and I was about to hand him the bill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about building a life with someone is that you don't notice when the foundation starts cracking. You're too busy adding new rooms, painting walls, making plans for the future. I met Mike Thompson at a networking event in downtown Phoenix back in January 2019. I was there promoting my digital marketing agency, Desert Bloom Marketing, which I'd started 6 months earlier with nothing but determination and a maxed-out credit card. Mike was representing Southwest Construction Solutions, this development company he co-owned with his business partner Ryan Carter. Mike had this presence about him, the kind of confidence that fills a room without being loud about it. He knew everyone's names, remembered their kids' ages, asked about their businesses like he genuinely cared. When he approached my booth that night, I was exhausted from explaining my services to skeptical contractors all day. But Mike listened differently. He asked smart questions about digital marketing strategies for luxury properties, took notes on his phone, and by the end of our conversation, he'd become my first major client. Our business relationship turned personal gradually, the way desert sunsets change from blue to gold without you noticing exactly when it happens. Mike would stop by my office to discuss campaigns, but we'd end up talking about everything else. He'd bring coffee from Canyon Creek Cafe, the little place around the corner that made these incredible cinnamon scones. He'd ask about my photography hobby, flip through the landscape shots I kept on my desk, and tell me I had an artist's eye for capturing light. By summer, we were spending weekends hiking the trails around Camelback Mountain. Mike would pack these elaborate picnics, complete with a portable speaker for music and a cooler full of my favorite sparkling water. He remembered that I was lactose intolerant before I did, started keeping almond milk at his apartment for my coffee. He'd listen to me talk about expanding my business, about my dreams of opening a second office, about wanting to work with high-end real estate developers across the Southwest. He never made me feel like my ambitions were too big or unrealistic. The proposal came in December, right before Christmas, during a weekend trip to our cabin in Flagstaff. We'd bought the place together that fall, this cozy retreat nestled in the pines where we could escape the Phoenix heat. Mike had planned this whole elaborate evening, complete with fairy lights strung around the deck and a fire crackling in the stone fireplace. When he got down on one knee, the ring catching the firelight, I couldn't imagine saying anything but yes. Planning our wedding during the early months of 2020 felt like navigating through a minefield of changing regulations and canceled venues. We'd originally wanted this big celebration at the Arizona Biltmore, but when the pandemic hit, we scaled everything down to an intimate ceremony in Scottsdale with just our closest family and friends. Mike handled most of the logistics while I focused on growing my business, which had started taking off in ways I'd never imagined. Real estate developers were investing heavily in virtual marketing campaigns, and Desert Bloom was booming. The prenup conversation came up in May, about a month before our wedding. Mike brought it up casually over dinner at Mesa Ridge Steakhouse, this upscale place where he liked to take important clients. He said his lawyer, Robert Sterling, had recommended it as a smart financial move for both of us. "We're both business owners," he explained, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "This just protects what we've each built independently. It's not about not trusting each other, it's about being practical." I agreed without much thought. My business was growing rapidly, and I wanted to protect what I'd built from scratch. We met with Mike's lawyer the following week, this imposing man in an expensive suit who explained the documents in language that sounded both legal and reassuring. The prenup seemed straightforward, mostly focused on keeping our business assets separate and outlining spousal support terms. I skimmed through the pages, signed where Sterling pointed, and filed it away in my mental category of important papers I hope I'll never need. Our wedding day was perfect, despite the limitations, small and intimate, held in the garden of a boutique hotel in Old Town Scottsdale. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace and carried white roses that smelled like summer. Mike looked handsome in his navy suit, and when he said his vows about being my partner in all things, about supporting my dreams and building a life together, I believed every word. We honeymooned in Sedona, spent 5 days hiking Red Rock Canyons and talking about the future we were going to create together. The first 2 years of marriage felt like everything I'd hoped for. My business continued expanding, landing contracts with major developers throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Mike's construction company seemed to be thriving too, always working on multiple projects simultaneously. We settled into this comfortable rhythm, where we'd work hard during the week and spend weekends at the Flagstaff cabin, hiking and taking photographs of the changing seasons. Mike was supportive of my success, in ways that surprised me. When I landed my biggest contract ever, a year-long marketing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Campaign for a luxury resort development in Scottsdale. He insisted on taking me to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Phoenix to celebrate. When I hired my first full-time employee, Amanda Foster, he brought champagne to the office and made a toast about entrepreneurs supporting entrepreneurs. He never seemed threatened by my growing success or resentful of the long hours I spent building my company. But something started shifting in late 2022, subtle changes that I attributed to normal marriage adjustments and business pressures. Mike became more secretive about his work, taking calls in the other room and closing his laptop when I walked into his home office. He'd always been protective of his business relationships, but now he seemed almost paranoid about discussing clients or projects. When I'd ask about specific developments he was working on, he'd give vague answers about confidential details and, quote, competitive information. His schedule became increasingly erratic, too. He'd leave for site visits early in the morning and not return until late at night, usually claiming he'd been dealing with contractor issues or meeting with potential investors. Weekend trips to Flagstaff became less frequent, with Mike always having some urgent work crisis that required his immediate attention. He'd apologize profusely, promised to make it up to me, but there was always another emergency the following weekend. The financial conversations became more tense as well. Mike had always handled most of our joint expenses, paying the mortgage on our Scottsdale house and managing our shared investment accounts. But he started asking more questions about my business income, wanting to know specific details about contracts and payment schedules. When I asked why he needed such detailed information, he'd say he was trying to plan our tax strategy or optimize our investment portfolio. It sounded reasonable, but something about his intensity made me uncomfortable. By early 2023, Mike's personality seemed to be changing in ways I couldn't ignore. He became more critical of small things, like how I organized the kitchen or managed my work schedule. He'd make comments about my obsession with photography, as if my hobby was somehow taking away from our relationship. He started questioning my business decisions, suggesting that I was expanding too quickly or taking on too many risky clients. These weren't the supportive, encouraging conversations we used to have about my work. The turning point came in March 2024, during what should have been a celebration. Desert Bloom had just been featured in Southwest Business Magazine as one of Arizona's fastest-growing marketing agencies. The article included a photo of me in my office, surrounded by examples of our most successful campaigns. I was incredibly proud of the recognition, proof that all my hard work was paying off in measurable ways. Mike's reaction to the article was completely unexpected. Instead of celebration, he seemed almost angry about the publicity. He complained that the magazine had inflated my company's success, and that featuring me so prominently would attract unwanted attention from competitors. When I pointed out that media coverage was generally good for business, he accused me of caring more about recognition than about our marriage. The argument escalated quickly, with Mike storming out of the house and not returning until the next morning. That fight opened something between us that couldn't be closed again. The pretense of normalcy disappeared, replaced by this underlying tension that colored every interaction. Mike became increasingly distant, spending most evenings out at business dinners or working late at the office. When he was home, he seemed distracted and irritable, checking his phone constantly and responding to messages with an urgency that felt disproportionate to construction scheduling. I started noticing other changes too. Credit card statements that Mike usually handled himself began showing charges I didn't recognize. Expensive dinners at restaurants where we'd never eaten together, and hotel charges in cities where he'd never mentioned traveling for business. When I asked about these expenses, Mike would explain them as client entertainment or last-minute travel for project emergencies. His explanations always sounded plausible, but the frequency of these mysterious charges was increasing. The breaking point came on a warm evening in March when I decided to surprise Mike with dinner at Mesa Ridge Steakhouse, the place where we'd had so many important conversations during our relationship. I knew he'd been stressed about work, and I thought a romantic dinner might help us reconnect and address the growing distance between us. I made a reservation, put on the blue dress he'd always complimented, and drove to the restaurant with cautious optimism about salvaging our marriage. I spotted Mike immediately when I walked into the restaurant, but he wasn't alone. He was sitting in a corner booth with a young woman I'd never seen before, someone who looked barely out of college with long blonde hair and the kind of effortless beauty that comes from being 26 and carefree. They weren't having a business dinner. Mike's hand was covering hers across the table, and they were leaning into each other with the intimacy of people who've shared more than professional conversations. I stood frozen in the restaurant's entrance, watching my husband with this stranger, feeling like I was observing my life from outside my own body. The hostess asked if I was ready to be seated, and I mumbled something about changing my mind, backing out of the restaurant before Mike could notice me. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. That night, when Mike came home around 11 o'clock, I didn't confront him about the restaurant. Something told me I needed more information before having that conversation, needed to understand the full scope of what was happening in my marriage. Mike acted normally, kissing my forehead and apologizing for working late again, mentioning a difficult client meeting that had run longer than expected. His lies sounded so practiced, so effortless, that I wondered how long this deception had been going on. I spent that sleepless night staring at the ceiling, reviewing the past year of our marriage through this new lens of betrayal. All those mysterious business trips, late-night emergencies, and secretive phone calls suddenly made terrible sense. Mike hadn't just been hiding an affair from me, he'd been systematically lying about nearly every aspect of his life, while I focused on building my business and trusting that our marriage was solid. The next morning, Mike left for work early as usual, and I called my best friend Lisa Manning. Lisa had been skeptical of Mike from the beginning, though she'd never said anything directly critical about him. She was a family law attorney in Phoenix, someone who'd seen enough divorces to recognize red flags that civilians might miss. When I told her about seeing Mike at the restaurant, her first response wasn't shock or sympathy, but a practical question that terrified me. "Jen," she said quietly, "when was the last time you looked at your financial statements?" Lisa's question about financial statements hit me like cold water. I realized I hadn't looked at our joint accounts in months, maybe longer. Mike had always been meticulous about managing our shared finances, sending me monthly summaries and handling all the investment decisions. I'd been so focused on growing Desert Bloom marketing that I'd essentially handed over financial oversight to him, trusting that he was as careful with our money as he appeared to be with everything else. That afternoon, while Mike was supposedly at a construction site in Tempe, I drove to First National Bank of Arizona, where we kept our joint accounts. The branch manager, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Gonzalez, who'd helped us set up our accounts after we got married, greeted me warmly and pulled up our records without question. What she showed me on her computer screen made my stomach drop. Our joint checking account, which should have contained around $40,000 based on Mike's monthly reports, actually held less than $8,000. Our shared investment portfolio, which Mike claimed was worth over $400,000, had been systematically depleted over the past 18 months. Large transfers had been made to accounts I didn't recognize, always in amounts just under the threshold that would trigger automatic notifications to both account holders. Patricia printed out detailed statements going back 2 years, her expression growing more concerned as she reviewed the transactions. Many of the withdrawals had been authorized using Mike's digital signature alone. something that was technically permitted under our account structure but unusual for such large amounts. When I asked about the receiving accounts for these transfers, Patricia hesitated before explaining that they appeared to be business accounts registered in Nevada, but she couldn't access details about the account holders without additional authorization. I left the bank with a folder full of statements and a growing sense of dread about what else I might discover. The drive home took me through downtown Phoenix, past the gleaming office buildings where I'd first met Mike at that networking event. I remembered how impressed I'd been by his apparent success, his confident talk about major development projects and strategic partnerships. Now I wondered how much of that confidence had been built on money he was stealing from our marriage. That evening, Mike came home around 10 o'clock, looking tired and slightly disheveled. He microwaved leftover Chinese food and sat at our kitchen island, scrolling through his phone while eating. I watched him from the living room, this man who'd shared my bed for 4 years, and realized I had no idea who he really was. When he asked about my day, I mentioned a new client meeting and some photography equipment I was considering buying. He nodded absently, still focused on his phone, completely unaware that I'd spent the afternoon uncovering his theft. I waited until he fell asleep before beginning my real investigation. Using my laptop in the spare bedroom I'd converted into a home office, I started searching through our email accounts and shared digital files. Mike had always been somewhat secretive about his computer, but we'd shared passwords for most accounts as a gesture of marital transparency. What I found in his email drafts folder made me physically nauseated. There were dozens of unsent messages to someone named Stephanie Brooks, filled with intimate details about their relationship and future plans. Mike wrote about feeling trapped in our marriage, about waiting for the right moment to leave me so he could start his real life with her. He described our Scottsdale house as an investment that would fund their new beginning, and our Flagstaff cabin as a property they could sell to finance a move to California, where Stephanie apparently wanted to start a business. The most disturbing emails detailed Mike's financial strategy for what he called the transition. He'd been systematically moving money from our joint accounts to business accounts that Stephanie helped him establish in Nevada. These weren't random thefts, but carefully planned asset transfers designed to hide our marital wealth before filing for divorce. Mike had calculated that by the time I discovered the missing money, it would be too late to recover most of it through legal proceedings. I found detailed spreadsheets tracking every transfer, every hidden account, every piece of our financial life that Mike had been secretly dismantling. He'd even researched Arizona divorce laws, specifically community property statutes, that would entitle him to half of everything we'd built together, including my business. The irony was sickening. While stealing our joint assets, Mike was simultaneously planning to claim half of my independently successful company. The email that made me actually dizzy with rage was one where Mike described me as financially naive and too focused on her little photography hobby to notice real business. He told Stephanie that I'd been easy to manipulate because I trusted him to handle our investments while I played with my cute marketing company. He estimated that between the hidden Nevada accounts and his claim to half my business, he'd walk away from our marriage with over $2 million, while leaving me responsible for our joint debts and mortgage payments. Stephanie's role in this scheme became clearer as I read through more communications. She wasn't just Mike's girlfriend, but an active participant in the financial fraud. She'd helped him research Nevada banking laws, accompanied him on trips to establish the accounts, and even provided false documentation about her employment status to help legitimize some of the business account applications. In return, Mike had been funneling money to support her lifestyle, paying for her apartment in Tempe, her car payments, and even a planned cosmetic surgery procedure. The most chilling discovery was a timeline Mike had created for what he called Project Freedom. He'd planned to continue the financial transfers for another 6 months before filing for divorce, ensuring that most of our assets would be safely hidden in Nevada accounts that I wouldn't know existed. He'd calculated exactly how much he needed to steal to maximize his post-divorce wealth while minimizing his legal exposure. Every late night, every business trip, every mysterious charge had been part of this elaborate theft, disguised as marital problems. I spent 3 hours reading through documents that detailed the systematic destruction of everything I'd thought was real about my marriage. Mike hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been planning my financial ruin for over a year while I worked 70-hour weeks building a business that he intended to claim half ownership of. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated that I felt like I was reading about strangers rather than my own life. By 3 in the morning, I'd printed out the most damaging documents and hidden them in my photography equipment case, the one place Mike never looked, because he considered my artistic pursuits unimportant. I crawled into bed next to my sleeping husband, this man who was actively stealing from me while planning our divorce, and pretended to sleep while my mind raced through everything I'd discovered. The next morning, Mike left early for another supposed site visit, kissing my forehead and promising to be home for dinner. I waited exactly 10 minutes after his car disappeared down our street before calling Lisa and asking her to meet me at Canyon Creek Cafe as soon as possible. When she arrived 20 minutes later, I handed her the folder of bank statements and printed emails without saying a word. Lisa read through the documents with the focused intensity of someone trained to analyze legal evidence. Her expression grew darker with each page, and by the time she'd finished reviewing everything, she was practically vibrating with anger. "Jen," she said quietly, "this isn't just adultery and theft. This is systematic financial fraud with criminal implications. Mike isn't just cheating on you. He's been conducting a long-term criminal enterprise using your marriage as cover." The legal implications were staggering. Mike's actions constituted multiple felonies under Arizona law, including embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The Nevada accounts represented money laundering across state lines, which could trigger federal charges. But Lisa's immediate concern was protecting my assets before Mike realized I'd discovered his scheme. We had a narrow window to take legal action before he could move more money or accelerate his timeline for filing divorce. Lisa explained that my prenuptial agreement might contain protections I didn't remember signing, but she'd need to review the full document to understand my options. She recommended immediately freezing our joint accounts and consulting with a forensic accountant to trace all the stolen funds. Most importantly, she stressed that I couldn't let Mike know I'd discovered his activities until we'd secured evidence and legal protections. That afternoon, I met with Catherine Rodriguez, a divorce attorney Lisa recommended, who specialized in complex financial cases. Catherine's office occupied an entire floor of a downtown Phoenix high-rise, with conference rooms that overlooked the sprawling desert city where I'd built my life and business. Catherine had handled several high-profile divorces involving financial fraud, and her reputation for aggressive asset protection was exactly what I needed. Catherine reviewed my prenuptial agreement with the kind of forensic attention I'd never given it myself. As she read through the dense legal language, her eyebrows raised several times, and she made notes in the margins with increasing frequency. After an hour of careful analysis, she looked up at me with something approaching satisfaction. "Jen," she said, "I don't think you fully understand what you signed 4 years ago. This prenup contains some very unusual protective clauses that most standard agreements don't include. Specifically, there are provisions that activate under certain conditions that would completely void Mike's claims to your separate property." The document contained what Catherine called a morality clause that I'd completely forgotten about. If either spouse committed adultery or financial fraud during the marriage, they would forfeit all claims to the other spouse's separate property and business assets. Even more significantly, the prenup included a, quote, financial misconduct provision that would entitle the innocent spouse to seek damages for any assets stolen or hidden during the marriage. Catherine explained that Mike's lawyer had actually crafted a prenup that would destroy Mike's divorce strategy if his criminal activities could be proven in court. The irony was delicious. Mike had insisted on the prenuptial agreement to protect our respective business interests, never imagining that the same document would protect me from his own theft and infidelity. His lawyer had created the legal framework that would ultimately ensure his complete defeat. But proving Mike's fraud in court would require more than printed emails and bank statements. Catherine recommended hiring David Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing hidden assets in divorce cases. David had previously worked for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before starting his own practice, and his testimony had helped secure convictions in several major embezzlement cases throughout Arizona. I met David the following morning at his office in Scottsdale, a modest suite that belied his impressive reputation. David was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the methodical precision of someone who spent his days following money trails through complex financial structures. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and account numbers. David's analysis would take several weeks, but his preliminary review of the documents I'd provided confirmed Lisa's assessment about criminal activity. The pattern of transfers to Nevada accounts, combined with the timing and amounts, clearly indicated intentional asset concealment. More importantly, David believed he could trace the money through the Nevada banking system and potentially recover most of the stolen funds if we acted quickly. The waiting period was excruciating. I had to continue living with Mike, pretending everything was normal, while knowing he was actively stealing from me and planning my financial destruction. He'd become even more secretive in recent weeks, taking calls outside and spending most evenings away from home. When I asked about his schedule, he'd mention client dinners or evening site visits, explanations that I now knew were lies covering his time with Stephanie. Mike's behavior toward me had become almost dismissive, as if he'd already mentally divorced himself from our marriage. He'd stopped asking about my business, showing no interest in contracts I was negotiating or employees I was hiring. When I mentioned potential expansion plans for Desert Bloom marketing, he'd make vague comments about the risks of growing too quickly, advice that I now realized was designed to limit my company's value before he claimed half ownership. The most difficult part was maintaining my normal routine while gathering additional evidence. I started photographing Mike's documents when he left them accessible, using my professional camera skills to capture clear images of financial statements and business correspondence. I tracked his schedule more carefully, noting patterns in his absences and correlating them with credit card charges at restaurants and hotels where he was meeting Stephanie. Amanda Foster, my assistant at Desert Bloom, began asking if everything was okay at home. She'd noticed that I seemed distracted during client meetings and had stopped taking personal calls during work hours. I couldn't tell her the truth about my investigation, but her concern reminded me how much I had to lose if Mike's plan succeeded. My business wasn't just a source of income, but a community of employees and clients who depended on the company's stability. 3 weeks after beginning the forensic investigation, David called with preliminary results that exceeded my worst fears. Mike had stolen over $600,000 from our joint accounts, far more than the bank statements had initially revealed. The Nevada accounts contained not just our money but funds that appeared to have been diverted from Southwest Construction Solutions, suggesting that Mike was also embezzling from his business partnership with Ryan Carter. David had traced payments to Stephanie that totaled nearly $200,000 over 18 months, including rent for her apartment, car payments, credit card bills, and cash transfers that appeared to be supporting her lifestyle completely. Mike hadn't just been having an affair, but essentially maintaining Stephanie as a financially dependent mistress, using money stolen from our marriage and his business. The most damaging discovery was documentation showing that Mike had been preparing to file for bankruptcy for Southwest Construction Solutions while simultaneously hiding assets in the Nevada accounts. His plan involved claiming business losses to avoid paying creditors, while secretly maintaining access to millions of dollars through the hidden accounts. This wasn't just marital infidelity, but a complex financial fraud that could result in federal charges. Catherine reviewed David's preliminary findings with the intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial. The evidence was overwhelming, far beyond what we needed to invoke the prenup's protective clauses. Mike's activities constituted multiple violations that would not only void his claims to my business but potentially entitle me to seek damages for the stolen funds, plus penalties for the criminal misconduct. The question now was timing. We needed to coordinate legal action carefully to maximize asset recovery, while minimizing Mike's opportunity to hide additional funds or destroy evidence. Catherine recommended filing for divorce immediately, while simultaneously seeking emergency court orders to freeze all accounts and prevent further asset transfers. The goal was to catch Mike completely off guard before he could implement whatever backup plans he might have developed. I was sitting in Catherine's conference room, reviewing the legal strategy for confronting Mike, when my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. The message was from Mike, sent from what appeared to be a restaurant in Scottsdale. and it contained a photo of him and Stephanie raising champagne glasses in what looked like a celebration. The caption read, "To new beginnings and finally being free." That photograph of Mike and Stephanie toasting their future with champagne felt like a declaration of war. I stared at the image on my phone screen, these two people celebrating what they assumed would be my financial destruction, and something crystallized inside me that had been building for weeks. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money or protecting my business anymore. This was about ensuring that Mike's elaborate criminal scheme would collapse so spectacularly that he'd spend years dealing with the consequences. I forwarded the image to Catherine immediately, along with a message that simply said, "Accelerate everything." Within an hour, she'd called an emergency meeting for that evening with David Chen and a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who specialized in surveillance and evidence gathering. Catherine's office felt different at 7 o'clock at night, the downtown Phoenix skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, while we planned what amounted to a coordinated legal assault. Marcus Webb looked exactly like someone you'd want following cheating spouses and financial criminals. Middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, with the kind of face that disappears in crowds, and the methodical patience of someone who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement before starting his own practice. Catherine had used Marcus in several high-profile divorce cases, and his reputation for gathering irrefutable evidence was exactly what we needed to ensure Mike couldn't wiggle out of the charges we were preparing. Marcus reviewed the timeline David had constructed of Mike's financial activities, cross-referencing dates with the surveillance he'd already begun conducting. For the past week, he'd been discreetly following Mike's movements, documenting his meetings with Stephanie, and photographing their interactions at restaurants and hotels throughout the Phoenix area. The pictures Marcus showed us painted a clear picture of a couple who felt completely safe in their deception, openly affectionate in public places where anyone could witness their relationship. The surveillance had revealed patterns that would be crucial for the legal proceedings. Mike and Stephanie met regularly at a luxury apartment complex in Tempe where she lived, always during hours when he'd told me he was working late or meeting clients. They frequently dined at expensive restaurants in Scottsdale, often at the same places where Mike had taken me during our courtship, a detail that felt particularly insulting. Most importantly, Marcus had documented several trips to a Nevada bank where Mike had been making cash deposits, clear evidence of ongoing money laundering activities. David presented his complete forensic analysis, a document that read like a federal indictment. Mike had stolen over $800,000 from our joint accounts, but the theft was even more systematic than I'd initially realized. He'd been gradually increasing the amounts over time, testing my attention level and adjusting his strategy based on my lack of response. The progression showed criminal sophistication that went far beyond simple marital infidelity. The Nevada accounts contained not just stolen marital assets, but money that clearly belonged to Southwest Construction Solutions. David had traced payments from client accounts that should have gone to contractors and suppliers, funds that Mike had diverted to his personal use. The total amount of business-related theft exceeded $1.2 million, which meant Mike was simultaneously defrauding his business partner Ryan Carter and multiple construction clients throughout Arizona. Catherine explained that the criminal implications were staggering. Mike's activities constituted multiple felonies under both Arizona and federal law, including embezzlement, money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud. The interstate nature of the Nevada accounts would likely trigger federal prosecution, which meant Mike was facing potential prison time that could exceed 20 years. But our immediate focus was the divorce proceedings and asset recovery, using the criminal evidence to ensure Mike couldn't claim any portion of my business or remaining assets. The legal strategy Catherine outlined was designed to catch Mike completely unprepared. We would file for divorce the following Monday morning, simultaneously requesting emergency court orders to freeze all accounts and prevent further asset transfers. The forensic evidence would be presented immediately, along with a demand for full restitution plus damages under the Prenup's financial misconduct provisions. The goal was to hit Mike with such overwhelming evidence that his lawyer would recommend immediate settlement rather than risk criminal prosecution. Marcus recommended accelerating his surveillance to document Mike's activities over the weekend, when he'd likely be spending time with Stephanie and possibly moving additional funds. The photographic evidence of their relationship would be crucial for invoking the prenup's adultery clauses, while documenting any financial activities would help prevent last-minute asset concealment. Catherine wanted comprehensive documentation that would make Mike's denials impossible to sustain. The most challenging aspect of the strategy was maintaining normal behavior at home while preparing for legal warfare. I had to continue living with Mike, pretending everything was fine while knowing that within days, I'd be exposing his criminal activities in court. The psychological strain was enormous, but Catherine stressed that any change in my behavior might alert Mike to our investigation and give him time to destroy evidence or transfer additional funds. That weekend was surreal. Mike came home Friday evening in an unusually good mood, whistling while he made dinner and asking about my photography plans for the weekend. His cheerfulness felt obscene given everything I knew about his activities, but I managed to respond normally, while internally rehearsing the legal documents I'd soon be filing. When he mentioned working late Saturday to handle some urgent client issues, I just nodded and suggested he bring home Thai food for dinner. Saturday morning, while Mike was supposedly at a construction site, I drove to my office at Desert Bloom Marketing to review the asset protection measures Catherine had recommended. I needed to ensure that my business accounts were completely separate from any joint assets Mike might try to claim, and I wanted to document the company's financial independence to prevent him from arguing that marital funds had contributed to its success. Amanda noticed my tension immediately when I arrived at the office. She'd been working with me for 3 years, and her loyalty to the company went beyond professional obligation. When I explained that I was dealing with some personal legal issues that might affect the business, she offered to help however she could. I couldn't share details about Mike's criminal activities, but I asked her to compile comprehensive records of the company's financial history and client relationships. The documentation Amanda prepared was impressive. Desert Bloom Marketing had grown from a startup with 1 employee to a thriving agency with 12 full-time staff members, all while maintaining complete financial independence from my marriage. The company's success was entirely attributable to my vision, work ethic, and client relationships, with no meaningful contribution from Mike beyond his initial marketing contract. This evidence would be crucial for protecting the business from any claims Mike might make during divorce proceedings. Sunday evening, Mike returned home with flowers and a bottle of wine, suggesting we have a romantic dinner to reconnect after what he called a stressful period in our marriage. The performance was nauseating, but I played along, knowing it would be our last evening together as a married couple. Mike talked about wanting to plan a vacation, maybe a trip to Europe, where we could, quote, remember why we fell in love. His ability to lie so smoothly while planning my financial destruction was genuinely frightening. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clear desert sky that usually made me optimistic about the day ahead. Instead, I felt like I was preparing for battle as I dressed carefully in my most professional outfit and drove to Catherine's office. The legal documents were ready, the forensic evidence was compiled, and Marcus had provided additional surveillance photographs from the weekend, showing Mike and Stephanie together at multiple locations throughout Phoenix. Catherine's team had prepared what amounted to a legal nuclear weapon. The divorce petition outlined Mike's criminal activities in detail, supported by bank records, email evidence, and photographic documentation. The emergency motions requested immediate freezing of all assets, appointment of a receiver to manage the stolen funds, and preliminary injunctions preventing Mike from accessing any marital property. The financial misconduct claims under the prenup sought not just restitution, but punitive damages that could exceed $2 million. At precisely 9 o'clock Monday morning, Catherine's process server delivered the divorce papers to Mike at his office, while simultaneously filing all documents with the Maricopa County Superior Court. The timing was designed to prevent Mike from destroying evidence or moving funds before learning about the legal action. Within an hour, emergency orders had been issued freezing all accounts and requiring Mike to appear in court later that week for a preliminary hearing. Mike's call came at 9:47 a.m., his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine shock rather than just anger. He'd clearly never imagined that I possessed the knowledge or documentation to expose his criminal activities so comprehensively. His first words were, "What the hell is this?" followed by increasingly desperate attempts to explain away the evidence as misunderstandings or accounting errors. When I calmly told him that I'd discovered everything and that his lawyer should review the criminal implications, the call ended abruptly. The legal machinery moved with impressive speed once Catherine's evidence was presented to the court. Judge Patricia Williams, who would be handling our case, reviewed the emergency motions and supporting documentation with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood the serious nature of Mike's criminal activities. By Tuesday afternoon, temporary orders were in place that essentially froze Mike's access to any assets, while requiring him to provide complete financial disclosure under oath. David Chen's forensic analysis had been expanded to include a complete audit of Southwest Construction Solutions, revealing that Mike's theft from the business was even more extensive than initially calculated. Ryan Carter, Mike's business partner, was contacted by David as part of the investigation and expressed complete shock at the scope of the financial misconduct. Ryan had been unaware that Mike was systematically stealing from client accounts and hiding assets in Nevada, and he immediately cooperated with the investigation. The revelation that Mike had been defrauding his own business partner added another layer of criminal liability to his already overwhelming legal problems. Ryan hired his own attorney and began proceedings to remove Mike from the company while seeking restitution for the stolen funds. The business Mike had used as cover for his criminal activities was now collapsing around him, leaving him with no source of income to fund his legal defense. Wednesday brought news that Mike had hired Robert Sterling, the same lawyer who'd prepared our prenuptial agreement, to represent him in the divorce proceedings. The irony was delicious, given that Sterling's own document contained the clauses that would destroy Mike's case. But Catherine wasn't surprised by the choice. Sterling was an experienced divorce attorney who would at least understand the magnitude of Mike's legal problems, even if he couldn't solve them. Marcus Webb's surveillance continued producing damaging evidence of Mike's relationship with Stephanie, including photographs of them moving boxes from storage units that appeared to contain financial documents and personal property. The timing suggested that Mike was attempting to hide additional evidence despite the court orders, which could result in contempt charges and additional criminal penalties. Every action Mike took seemed to dig his legal hole deeper. The most satisfying development was learning that Mike's carefully constructed financial scheme was unraveling faster than he could contain it. The Nevada accounts had been frozen by court order, leaving him without access to the stolen funds he'd planned to use for his new life with Stephanie. His credit cards had been canceled, his access to business accounts had been terminated, and he was facing the prospect of funding his legal defense with whatever cash he could scrape together. Thursday afternoon, Catherine received a call from Robert Sterling requesting a settlement conference. Sterling had clearly reviewed the evidence and understood that Mike's position was legally indefensible. The criminal implications alone were severe enough to motivate a quick resolution, but the financial misconduct provisions in the prenup created additional liability that could bankrupt Mike even if he avoided prison. Catherine agreed to meet, but made it clear that any settlement would require full restitution plus damages. The settlement conference was scheduled for Friday morning at Catherine's office, giving both sides time to prepare their positions. Catherine was confident that Sterling would recommend immediate capitulation given the overwhelming evidence, but she wanted to be prepared for any desperate maneuvers Mike might attempt. The forensic evidence was so comprehensive that denial would be impossible, leaving Mike with no choice but to accept whatever terms we offered. Friday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that comes before a long-awaited confrontation. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that projected professional authority while making me feel armored for the battle ahead. Catherine had prepared a settlement offer that would require Mike to return all stolen funds, relinquish any claims to my business, and pay additional damages for the criminal misconduct. The terms were designed to ensure that Mike would face significant financial consequences while avoiding the lengthy process of criminal prosecution. The settlement meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Catherine's office, but Sterling called at 9:30 requesting a delay. Mike had apparently spent the night in police custody after being arrested on charges filed by the Arizona Attorney General's office, based on David's forensic evidence. The criminal investigation had proceeded independently of our divorce case, and Mike was now facing immediate prosecution for embezzlement and money laundering, while simultaneously dealing with the civil litigation. The arrest changed everything about our legal strategy. Mike's criminal defense would now take priority over the divorce proceedings, but the evidence would be the same in both cases. Catherine explained that the criminal charges would actually strengthen our position in the divorce case, since Mike's conviction would provide additional support for the financial misconduct claims under the prenup. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for ensuring that Mike faced maximum consequences for his actions. By noon Friday, Robert Sterling had called to inform Catherine that Mike was prepared to accept whatever settlement terms we offered, rather than risk additional criminal charges. The combination of the divorce evidence and the criminal prosecution had created a legal nightmare that Mike simply couldn't navigate successfully. His carefully planned scheme to steal my assets while claiming half my business had backfired so completely that he was facing bankruptcy and potential prison time. Catherine and I spent Friday afternoon drafting the settlement agreement that would officially end my marriage while ensuring that Mike faced appropriate consequences for his criminal activities. The terms required complete restitution of all stolen funds, forfeiture of any claims to my business or personal assets, and payment of additional damages for the financial misconduct. Mike would essentially walk away from our marriage with nothing, while owing substantial debts that would take years to repay. The psychological satisfaction of Mike's complete defeat was almost overwhelming. His elaborate criminal scheme had been designed to leave me financially ruined while he started a new life with Stephanie and millions of dollars in stolen assets. Instead, he was facing prison time, bankruptcy, and the destruction of his reputation throughout the Phoenix business community. The prenup he'd insisted on signing had become the legal framework for his own destruction, a perfect example of criminal arrogance leading to downfall. Saturday morning brought news that Mike had been released on bail but was required to surrender his passport and remain in Arizona pending trial. Stephanie had apparently disappeared from her Tempe apartment, leaving no forwarding address and abandoning the lifestyle Mike had been funding with stolen money. The relationship that had motivated Mike's criminal activities had evaporated as soon as the legal consequences became real, leaving him isolated and facing the wreckage of his life alone. I spent Saturday afternoon at Desert Bloom Marketing, reviewing the business plans I'd been forced to postpone during the investigation. The company had continued operating successfully despite the personal turmoil, a testament to the professional team I'd built and the solid foundation that had nothing to do with my marriage. My employees had rallied around the company during the difficult period, and their loyalty reminded me why building this business had been worth the sacrifices I'd made. The contrast between my thriving business and Mike's criminal collapse was stark. While he'd been planning to steal half my company's value, I'd been building something genuine and sustainable that would continue growing long after our divorce was finalized. His scheme had been based on deception and theft, while my success came from hard work, creativity, and genuine relationships with clients and employees. The difference in our approaches to life and business had never been clearer. Sunday evening, I received a call from Lisa Manning, who'd been following the case developments with professional interest and personal concern. She'd reviewed the settlement documents and was amazed by how completely Mike's criminal activities had been exposed and punished. The case would become a cautionary tale in Phoenix legal circles about the dangers of financial fraud in marriage and the importance of thorough prenuptial agreements that protect innocent spouses from criminal misconduct. The week ahead would bring the final court hearing, where Judge Williams would review the settlement agreement and officially dissolve our marriage. Mike would be required to appear in court and formally acknowledge his criminal activities while agreeing to the financial terms that would ensure appropriate restitution. The hearing would be the final act in a legal drama that had transformed me from a victim of financial fraud into someone who'd successfully fought back against criminal deception and won complete victory. The morning of our final court hearing arrived with that peculiar Arizona autumn weather, where the desert air feels crisp despite the blazing sun. I chose my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without appearing vindictive, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me for my college graduation. I wanted to look like someone who'd fought for justice rather than revenge, even though the distinction felt meaningless, given what Mike had put me through. Catherine met me at the courthouse entrance at 8:30, carrying 2 briefcases filled with documentation that represented months of investigation and legal preparation. The Maricopa County Superior Court building was already bustling with lawyers, defendants, and families navigating the complex machinery of justice. Our case was scheduled for 9 o'clock in Judge Patricia Williams' courtroom, but Catherine wanted time to review final details and prepare for any last-minute surprises Mike's lawyer might attempt. Judge Williams had a reputation for running efficient proceedings while maintaining strict control over her courtroom. She'd been on the bench for 15 years, handling some of Phoenix's most complex divorce cases, and her preliminary review of our evidence suggested she understood the serious nature of Mike's criminal activities. Catherine felt confident that Judge Williams would approve the settlement terms we'd negotiated, but courtroom proceedings always carried inherent unpredictability. Robert Sterling arrived at the courthouse looking haggard and defeated, clearly struggling with the impossible task of representing a client whose criminal activities were thoroughly documented and legally indefensible. Sterling had built his career on high-end divorce cases, but Mike's situation was so extreme that no amount of legal skill could mitigate the consequences. The best Sterling could do was minimize Mike's exposure, while ensuring the settlement terms were legally binding. Mike appeared at 8:50, accompanied by Sterling, and looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd watched his carefully constructed life collapse completely. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive but somehow diminished on his frame, as if the clothes belonged to the successful businessman he'd pretended to be, rather than the criminal defendant he'd become. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly institutional feel. Judge Williams entered promptly at 9 o'clock, her black robes and serious expression commanding immediate attention from everyone present. The bailiff called our case, and Catherine stood to present the settlement agreement that would officially end my marriage while ensuring Mike faced appropriate consequences for his actions. Catherine's presentation was masterful, clearly outlining the evidence of Mike's criminal activities, while explaining how the prenuptial agreement's protective clauses had been triggered by his misconduct. She presented David Chen's forensic analysis, Marcus Webb's surveillance documentation, and the comprehensive financial records that proved Mike had stolen over $800,000 from our joint accounts, while simultaneously embezzling more than $1 million from his business partnership. Judge Williams reviewed the evidence with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before, but recognized the unusual scope of Mike's criminal activities. She asked pointed questions about the timeline of the theft, the Nevada accounts, and the documentation of Mike's relationship with Stephanie Brooks. Catherine answered each question with specific references to the evidence, building a case that was both legally sound and factually overwhelming. When Judge Williams asked Mike to confirm his understanding of the settlement terms, his voice was barely audible as he acknowledged his criminal activities and agreed to the financial restitution. The man who'd once commanded rooms full of investors and contractors could barely speak above a whisper, as he formally admitted to stealing from his wife and business partner. His lawyer had to prompt him twice to respond to the judge's questions, and even then, his answers were hesitant and defeated. The settlement terms were comprehensive and punitive. Mike would forfeit all claims to my business and personal assets, return the full amount of stolen funds through a structured payment plan, and pay additional damages totaling $400,000 for the financial misconduct. He would also be responsible for all legal fees and court costs, ensuring that his criminal activities would cost him significantly more than the amount he'd stolen. The prenup's protective clauses had worked exactly as intended, voiding Mike's claims to any marital property while providing additional remedies for his criminal misconduct. Judge Williams noted that the document was unusually comprehensive in its protective provisions, suggesting that Sterling had inadvertently created the legal framework for his current client's complete defeat. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Judge Williams approved the settlement agreement and granted the divorce, officially dissolving our marriage while implementing the financial terms that would ensure Mike faced years of consequences for his actions. The court order included provisions for monitoring Mike's compliance with the payment schedule, with additional penalties for any attempts to hide assets or delay restitution. The legal machinery would continue operating long after our divorce was finalized, ensuring that Mike couldn't escape his obligations. The criminal charges against Mike would proceed separately, but Catherine explained that his guilty plea in the divorce case would likely influence the prosecution's approach to sentencing. The combination of state and federal charges meant Mike was facing potential prison time that could exceed 10 years, particularly given the sophisticated nature of his financial crimes and the substantial amounts involved. His carefully planned scheme to steal my assets had transformed into a legal nightmare that would define the rest of his life. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and exhaustion. The legal battle was over, but the emotional processing would continue for months. Mike's betrayal had been so complete, so systematic, that understanding its full impact would take time. The man I'd married had been revealed as a criminal who'd spent years planning my financial destruction while pretending to love and support me. Catherine drove me back to my office at Desert Bloom Marketing, where Amanda and the rest of my team were waiting with champagne and congratulations. They'd followed the case developments with the kind of personal investment that comes from working closely with someone during a crisis. The business had not only survived the turmoil but actually grown stronger, landing several major contracts while I'd been focused on the legal proceedings. The afternoon was spent reviewing business plans that had been postponed during the investigation and legal preparation. Desert Bloom Marketing was positioned for significant expansion, with new clients throughout the Southwest and opportunities to open additional offices in other markets. The company I'd built independently of my marriage was now completely protected from any claims Mike might have made, free to grow according to my vision and hard work. David Chen called that evening to report that the Nevada accounts had been successfully frozen and that recovery of the stolen funds was proceeding faster than expected. The financial institutions had been cooperative once presented with the court orders, and most of the hidden assets would be returned within 30 days. Mike's elaborate money laundering scheme had been dismantled as thoroughly as his marriage and business reputation. The Phoenix business community's reaction to Mike's criminal activities was swift and decisive. Southwest Construction Solutions was facing multiple lawsuits from clients and contractors who'd been defrauded, and the company's reputation was so damaged that bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Mike's former business partner, Ryan Carter, had distanced himself completely from the scandal, working with prosecutors to ensure that Mike faced maximum consequences for his crimes. Stephanie Brooks had vanished completely after Mike's arrest, leaving behind only unpaid bills and a trail of false information about her background and employment. Marcus Webb's investigation had revealed that she'd been involved in similar financial schemes with other men, suggesting that her relationship with Mike was part of a broader pattern of criminal activity. The police were investigating whether she'd been operating what amounted to a long-term fraud enterprise. The media attention was more intense than I'd expected, with local business publications covering the case as an example of how financial fraud in marriage could destroy successful businesses and reputations. I gave a single interview to Southwest Business Magazine, emphasizing the importance of financial transparency in marriage and the protective value of comprehensive prenuptial agreements. The story ran with the headline, "Phoenix Entrepreneur Defeats Husband's Criminal Scheme Through Legal Preparation." 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from the Arizona Attorney General's office informing me that Mike had accepted a plea agreement that would result in a 7-year prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation in prosecuting other financial crimes. The deal would also require him to pay additional restitution to the clients and contractors he'd defrauded through his construction business, ensuring that his criminal activities would have long-term financial consequences. The psychological impact of Mike's complete defeat was complex and evolving. Part of me felt vindicated by the justice system's response to his crimes, while another part mourned the loss of the man I'd thought I'd married. The realization that our entire relationship had been built on deception was devastating in ways that went beyond the financial theft. I'd invested 4 years of my life in someone who'd been systematically planning my destruction while pretending to love and support me. Recovery involved rebuilding my sense of trust and judgment while processing the trauma of such comprehensive betrayal. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in financial abuse and criminal victimization, someone who helped me understand that Mike's sophisticated deception wasn't a reflection of my naivete, but rather evidence of his criminal expertise. The shame I'd initially felt about being deceived gradually transformed into recognition of my strength in fighting back successfully. Desert Bloom Marketing continued growing throughout the autumn, landing contracts with major developers in Las Vegas and Albuquerque, while expanding our Phoenix operations. The company's success felt like vindication of everything I'd built independently of my marriage. Proof that my professional judgment and work ethic were sound, despite the personal betrayal I'd experienced. My employees rallied around the business during the difficult period, and their loyalty reminded me why building this company had been worth the sacrifices. The financial recovery was remarkably complete, with most of the stolen funds returned through the court-ordered restitution process. Mike's assets were liquidated systematically to fund the payments, including the sale of his cars, jewelry, and personal property. The Nevada accounts had contained not just my money but additional funds that Mike had been planning to use for his new life with Stephanie. Money that was now being returned to the various victims of his crimes. 6 months after the divorce, I received an unexpected call from Ryan Carter, Mike's former business partner, who wanted to discuss a potential collaboration between our companies. Southwest Construction Solutions had been restructured under new management, and Ryan was interested in developing a long-term marketing partnership with Desert Bloom. The conversation was initially awkward, given our shared history with Mike, but Ryan's professionalism and genuine remorse about his former partner's crimes made the discussion productive. The collaboration with Ryan's restructured company became one of Desert Bloom's most successful partnerships, generating significant revenue while helping both businesses recover from the scandal Mike had created. Working with Ryan provided a unique perspective on Mike's criminal activities, revealing that his deception had been even more systematic than I'd realized. Ryan had been completely unaware of the financial crimes, trusting Mike's explanations for accounting irregularities that should have triggered more intensive investigation. A year after the divorce, I decided to sell our Flagstaff cabin, the property that had represented so many happy memories from our relationship but was now tainted by knowledge of Mike's criminal planning. The sale was handled quickly and quietly, with the proceeds donated to a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to victims of financial abuse. The gesture felt like a final severing of ties to the life I'd built with someone who'd been systematically betraying me. The new house I purchased in Paradise Valley was smaller but more architecturally interesting than our Scottsdale home, with large windows that showcased the desert landscape, and a studio space perfect for my photography hobby. The house felt like a fresh start, a place where I could build a life based on authentic relationships and genuine achievements, rather than the deception that had defined my marriage. Every room reflected my personal taste and values, untainted by memories of Mike's lies. Desert Bloom Marketing celebrated its 5th anniversary 2 years after the divorce, having grown from a one-person startup to a regional marketing agency with offices in 3 states. The company's success story was featured in multiple business publications, often with references to how the business had survived and thrived, despite the personal crisis I'd navigated. The recognition felt earned through hard work and resilience, rather than the artificial success Mike had tried to steal. The criminal justice system's response to Mike's crimes continued evolving long after our divorce was finalized. His cooperation with prosecutors led to additional charges against other individuals involved in construction industry fraud, including some of the contractors who'd helped him hide assets and manipulate financial records. The case became a landmark prosecution for financial crimes in Arizona, establishing precedents that would help future victims of similar schemes. Mike's prison sentence was served at a federal facility in California, far from the Phoenix business community where his crimes had occurred. I received occasional updates about his situation through David Chen, who continued monitoring the restitution payments and asset recovery process. Mike's life in prison was reportedly difficult, with his sophisticated financial crimes making him a target for other inmates who viewed white-collar criminals as privileged and vulnerable. The psychological healing process was gradual but consistent, supported by therapy, strong friendships, and the satisfaction of building something genuine and sustainable through my business. I learned to trust my instincts again while developing better strategies for recognizing deception and protecting myself from manipulation. The experience had been traumatic but ultimately strengthening, proving that I could survive comprehensive betrayal and emerge stronger. 3 years after the divorce, I met Daniel Rodriguez at a charity event for the Phoenix Children's Hospital. Daniel was a pediatric surgeon who'd recently moved to Arizona from California, someone whose genuine kindness and professional dedication provided a stark contrast to Mike's criminal manipulations. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and gradual trust, rather than the intense passion that had characterized my marriage. Daniel's integrity was evident in every interaction, from his treatment of patients and colleagues to his approach to our relationship. He was transparent about his finances, supportive of my business success, and genuinely interested in my photography hobby. The contrast with Mike's deception was so complete that dating Daniel felt like discovering what healthy relationships were supposed to look like. His presence in my life provided evidence that not all men were criminals disguised as partners. The engagement came after 18 months of dating, during a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant in Scottsdale. Daniel's proposal was simple and sincere, without the elaborate staging that had characterized Mike's manipulative gestures. The ring was beautiful but modest, chosen because Daniel knew I preferred understated elegance to flashy displays of wealth. His approach to marriage was based on partnership and mutual support, rather than the financial calculations that had motivated Mike. Our prenuptial agreement was handled by Catherine Rodriguez, who crafted a document that protected both our interests while reflecting the lessons I'd learned from Mike's criminal activities. The agreement was comprehensive but fair, designed to encourage financial transparency while providing protection against the kind of systematic deception I'd experienced. Daniel supported the prenup enthusiastically, understanding that my caution was based on painful experience rather than lack of trust. The wedding was held at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, a venue that reflected our shared love of Arizona's natural beauty and provided a perfect setting for celebrating a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. The ceremony was attended by family, friends, and employees from Desert Bloom Marketing, people who'd supported me through the difficult period and were genuinely happy to see me find love again. The photographer captured moments of genuine joy and connection, images that would represent the authentic happiness I'd found after surviving Mike's betrayal. Desert Bloom Marketing continued thriving under my leadership, eventually expanding to include offices in Denver and Salt Lake City, while maintaining its reputation for innovative marketing campaigns and exceptional client service. The company's success provided financial security and professional satisfaction that was entirely independent of my personal relationships, ensuring that I would never again be vulnerable to the kind of financial manipulation Mike had attempted. The final chapter of Mike's story came 5 years after our divorce, when he was released from federal prison and immediately faced additional state charges for crimes that had been discovered during his incarceration. His attempts to rebuild his life were hampered by his criminal record, his substantial restitution obligations, and the complete destruction of his reputation in the Phoenix business community. The man who'd once commanded respect and trust was now universally recognized as a criminal who'd betrayed everyone who'd believed in him. I never spoke to Mike again after the divorce hearing, but I occasionally received updates about his situation through the legal system's monitoring of his restitution payments. His post-prison life was reportedly difficult, with employment limited to low-paying jobs that barely covered his living expenses, while he continued making payments to his various victims. The luxurious lifestyle he'd tried to steal from me had been replaced by the financial struggle that his crimes had earned him. The desert sunset from my Paradise Valley home provides daily reminders of the beauty and resilience that define Arizona's landscape and character. Like the desert plants that survive harsh conditions through deep roots and careful resource management, I'd learned to thrive despite the challenges Mike's betrayal had created. The experience had been painful but ultimately transformative, teaching me lessons about trust, strength, and the importance of building life on authentic foundations rather than deceptive appearances. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 7 years after that devastating courtroom hearing where Mike's world had collapsed in front of Judge Williams. I was reviewing quarterly reports for Desert Bloom Marketing when my assistant Amanda transferred a call from someone identifying himself as Detective James Morrison with the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. His voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would reopen wounds I thought had healed completely. Detective Morrison explained that Mike had been found dead in his studio apartment in Tempe, an apparent suicide that had occurred sometime during the previous weekend. The sparse details he provided painted a picture of desperation and isolation that felt both shocking and somehow inevitable. Mike had been discovered by his landlord after missing rent payments, surrounded by empty bottles, and what appeared to be a lengthy written confession detailing financial crimes that went far beyond what had been prosecuted during our divorce proceedings. The confession, which Detective Morrison described as over 50 pages of handwritten documentation, revealed that Mike's criminal activities had been far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had realized. He'd been operating fraudulent schemes since college, systematically targeting women through romantic relationships while embezzling from every employer who trusted him with financial responsibilities. Our marriage hadn't been his first attempt at large-scale theft through intimate deception, merely his most ambitious and ultimately most catastrophic failure. Detective Morrison requested a meeting to discuss the confession's implications for other ongoing investigations, explaining that Mike had provided detailed information about accomplices, victims, and criminal enterprises that could help solve cases dating back over 15 years. The confession named dozens of individuals who'd been defrauded through various schemes, including several women who'd been targeted through the same pattern of romantic manipulation and financial theft that I'd experienced. The meeting with Detective Morrison took place at Phoenix Police Headquarters, in a conference room that felt sterile and institutional compared to the courthouse, where I'd last encountered Mike's attempts to manipulate the legal system. Morrison was accompanied by Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, who explained that Mike's confession had triggered a federal investigation into a network of financial criminals operating throughout the Southwest. Agent Chen presented evidence that Mike had been connected to an organized criminal enterprise that specialized in romance scams and financial fraud, with Stephanie Brooks serving as a key operative who recruited and managed male accomplices. The relationship I'd witnessed between Mike and Stephanie hadn't been a genuine romance but rather a professional partnership in criminal activity, with Stephanie directing Mike's actions while maintaining connections to similar operations in other states. The scope of the criminal network was staggering, involving hundreds of victims across multiple states and financial losses totaling over $20 million. Mike's confession provided detailed documentation of the enterprise's operations, including recruitment methods, training procedures, and money laundering techniques that had enabled the organization to operate successfully for over a decade. His death had apparently been motivated by fear of the criminal organization's response to his cooperation with law enforcement. The revelation that my marriage had been part of a calculated criminal operation rather than a personal betrayal was both relieving and deeply disturbing. Understanding that Mike's deception hadn't been uniquely targeted at me provided some psychological comfort, but recognizing the sophisticated nature of the manipulation I'd experienced was frightening in its implications. I'd been selected as a victim based on my financial success and perceived vulnerability, not because of any personal relationship with Mike. Agent Chen explained that my case had become a model for how victims could successfully fight back against sophisticated financial fraud, and that the prenuptial agreement Catherine Rodriguez had crafted was being studied by legal professionals as an example of effective asset protection. The systematic documentation David Chen had provided during our divorce had helped establish investigative techniques that were now being used in similar cases throughout the country. The FBI requested my cooperation in their ongoing investigation, particularly my insights into Mike's psychological manipulation techniques and my documentation of his criminal activities. Agent Chen emphasized that my willingness to pursue justice aggressively had likely prevented Mike from victimizing additional women, since his criminal conviction and financial ruin had eliminated his ability to maintain the successful businessman persona that had been essential to his fraud operations. The psychological impact of learning about Mike's extensive criminal history was complex and unexpected. Part of me felt vindicated by evidence that his deception had been so sophisticated that any reasonable person might have been fooled, while another part was disturbed by how completely I'd been manipulated by someone whose entire identity had been fabricated. The man I'd married hadn't just been unfaithful or financially irresponsible. He'd been a professional criminal whose life's work involved destroying women through romantic deception. Catherine Rodriguez reviewed the FBI's findings with me, explaining that the new evidence further validated the legal strategy we'd pursued during the divorce proceedings. The prenuptial agreement's protective clauses had been even more crucial than we'd realized, since Mike's criminal activities had been far more extensive than the financial theft we'd documented. Without those protections, I could have been held liable for Mike's criminal activities or lost significantly more assets to his fraudulent schemes. The media attention generated by the FBI investigation was intense, but ultimately positive for my business and personal reputation. Southwest Business Magazine featured my story as an example of how victims of financial fraud could successfully seek justice while protecting their assets and rebuilding their lives. The article emphasized the importance of comprehensive legal preparation and aggressive response to financial crimes, using my case as a template for other potential victims. Desert Bloom Marketing received significant positive publicity from the coverage, with several major clients expressing admiration for how I'd handled the crisis, while maintaining the company's growth and reputation. The business had now expanded to include offices in 6 states, with over 40 employees and annual revenue exceeding $8 million. The success I'd built independently of my marriage had not only survived Mike's criminal activities, but had grown stronger through the challenges. The FBI investigation led to arrests of 12 individuals connected to the criminal network, including Stephanie Brooks, who was apprehended in Las Vegas while operating a similar romance scam targeting wealthy divorcees. Her arrest provided closure to the question of what had happened after she'd disappeared from Phoenix, revealing that she'd simply moved to a new location to continue the same criminal activities with different accomplices and victims. Stephanie's prosecution revealed the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise, with detailed training materials for romance scams, psychological profiling of potential victims, and systematic methods for identifying and exploiting financial vulnerabilities. The organization had operated like a business, with quotas for financial theft, performance reviews for criminal operatives, and expansion plans for targeting new geographic markets and demographic groups. The trial proceedings provided disturbing insights into how I'd been selected and targeted as a victim, with evidence showing that Mike had researched my business success and personal background extensively before our supposedly chance meeting at the networking event. The encounter that had seemed like natural attraction had actually been a carefully planned criminal operation, with Mike coached on my interests, professional goals, and psychological vulnerabilities. Learning that our entire relationship had been orchestrated by criminals was deeply unsettling, but also liberating in unexpected ways. The guilt I'd carried about failing to recognize Mike's deception was replaced by understanding that I'd been victimized by professionals whose criminal expertise had been developed through years of successful fraud operations. My response to the situation had been intelligent and effective, rather than the naive reaction I'd sometimes worried it represented. The financial recovery from Mike's criminal activities was ultimately complete, with the FBI's asset forfeiture program returning funds that had been hidden in accounts we'd never discovered during the divorce proceedings. The total amount recovered exceeded $2 million, far more than the initial theft we'd documented, providing evidence of how extensively Mike had been stealing from our marriage while planning his criminal enterprise's expansion. Daniel's support during the FBI investigation and media attention was unwavering and genuinely comforting, providing evidence of how different a healthy relationship felt compared to the manipulation I'd experienced with Mike. His reaction to learning about the criminal network was protective rather than judgmental, focused on my safety and emotional well-being, rather than any concern about how the revelations might affect his reputation or our relationship. Our marriage had now lasted 4 years, built on the kind of transparency and mutual respect that provided a stark contrast to the deception that had characterized my relationship with Mike. Daniel's integrity was evident in every aspect of our life together, from his treatment of patients and colleagues to his approach to our shared finances and future planning. The trust we'd built felt solid and authentic, based on consistent actions rather than manipulative words. The therapy I'd continued throughout the FBI investigation helped me process the new information about Mike's criminal activities while maintaining the emotional stability I'd worked hard to achieve. Understanding that my experience had been part of a broader pattern of criminal victimization helped reduce the personal shame I'd carried about being deceived, while recognizing my successful response as evidence of strength rather than luck. Desert Bloom Marketing's continued success provided professional satisfaction that was entirely independent of my personal relationships, or the criminal activities that had once threatened to destroy everything I'd built. The company's reputation for innovative marketing strategies and exceptional client service had been enhanced rather than damaged by the publicity surrounding my successful fight against financial fraud, with several major clients specifically mentioning their admiration for my resilience and determination. The speaking engagements that resulted from the media coverage provided opportunities to help other victims of financial fraud while raising awareness about the sophisticated nature of modern criminal enterprises. My presentations to business groups, legal associations, and victim advocacy organizations emphasized the importance of financial transparency in relationships, comprehensive legal protection, and aggressive response to financial crimes. The nonprofit organization I established to provide legal assistance to victims of financial fraud had grown into a regional resource that helped dozens of people each year navigate the complex process of fighting back against sophisticated criminal operations. The organization's success provided evidence that my traumatic experience had been transformed into something positive that could help protect others from similar victimization. The criminal trials of Stephanie Brooks and her associates provided the final chapter in the legal proceedings that had begun with my divorce from Mike 7 years earlier. Stephanie was convicted on federal charges including conspiracy, money laundering, and fraud, receiving a 15-year prison sentence that reflected the sophisticated nature of her criminal enterprise and the extensive harm inflicted on victims throughout multiple states. The victim impact statements from the trials revealed the devastating effects of the criminal network's activities, with dozens of women describing financial ruin, emotional trauma, and destroyed trust in relationships. My statement emphasized how aggressive legal response and comprehensive documentation had enabled not just personal recovery, but also the investigation that had ultimately dismantled the entire criminal organization. The restitution orders resulting from the criminal trials provided additional financial recovery for victims, while ensuring that the convicted criminals would face years of financial consequences for their crimes. The asset forfeiture program seized properties, vehicles, and financial accounts throughout the Southwest, with proceeds distributed to victims based on documented losses and the availability of recovered funds. The Phoenix business community's response to the complete story of Mike's criminal activities was overwhelmingly supportive, with many colleagues expressing admiration for how I'd transformed a personal crisis into a successful legal battle that had protected other potential victims. The professional relationships I'd built over years of ethical business practices provided a foundation of trust and respect that had weathered the scandal without significant damage. The anniversary of Mike's death passed quietly, marked only by a brief conversation with Detective Morrison about the ongoing impact of the investigation he'd initiated. The criminal network that had once threatened so many victims had been completely dismantled, with most of the key operatives either imprisoned or under ongoing federal supervision. The systematic fraud that had once seemed unstoppable had been defeated through careful investigation and aggressive prosecution. The desert landscape surrounding Phoenix continued providing daily reminders of resilience and adaptation, with native plants thriving in harsh conditions through deep roots and efficient resource management. The metaphor felt appropriate for my own journey through betrayal and recovery, having learned to build strength through authentic relationships and genuine achievements, rather than the artificial success that criminals like Mike tried to steal from others. The final legal document related to Mike's criminal activities was a court order closing the restitution case and confirming that all financial obligations had been satisfied through asset recovery and victim compensation. The paperwork represented the official end of a legal saga that had lasted over 7 years. From the initial discovery of financial theft, through the complete dismantling of the criminal network that had made it possible. Daniel and I purchased a new home in the foothills north of Phoenix, a contemporary design that showcased the desert's natural beauty, while providing space for the art studio and expanded office that reflected our growing family and professional success. The house felt like a symbol of the authentic life we'd built together, based on genuine love and mutual respect, rather than the manipulation and deception that had characterized my previous marriage. The photography exhibition I curated for the Phoenix Art Museum featured landscape images that documented Arizona's recovery from natural disasters, with proceeds benefiting organizations that provided assistance to victims of financial crimes. The exhibition's theme of resilience and renewal felt personally meaningful while raising awareness about the ongoing need for support services for people recovering from sophisticated criminal victimization. Desert Bloom Marketing celebrated its 10th anniversary with recognition as Arizona's Marketing Agency of the Year, an achievement that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked to build independently of the criminal activities that had once threatened to destroy it. The company's success story had become a model for how businesses could survive and thrive despite the personal crises that sometimes affect their leaders. The final conversation with Agent Chen occurred at a victim advocacy conference, where we both spoke about the importance of aggressive response to financial crimes and comprehensive legal protection. She mentioned that the investigation initiated by Mike's confession had led to additional prosecutions and the recovery of millions of dollars for victims throughout the country, providing evidence that my decision to fight back had had implications far beyond my personal situation. The sunset from our new home's terrace provided a perfect view of the Sonoran Desert's evening transformation, when the harsh daylight gave way to the gentle colors that made Arizona's landscape famous throughout the world. The daily reminder of natural beauty and resilience felt like an appropriate metaphor for the journey, from victimization to recovery, from betrayal to authentic love, from criminal deception to genuine success. The documentary crew arrived at Desert Bloom Marketing on a crisp December morning, 10 years after the courtroom hearing that had ended my marriage and exposed Mike's criminal empire. The producer, Maria Santos from Phoenix Public Television, had spent months researching the case for a feature documentary about financial fraud and victim recovery, focusing on how systematic documentation and aggressive legal response could protect others from sophisticated criminal schemes. Maria's team set up cameras in my corner office, the same space where I'd first discovered the suspicious bank transfers that had unraveled Mike's elaborate theft operation. The irony wasn't lost on me that this room, which had witnessed my darkest moments of betrayal and confusion, was now being used to document a story of recovery and justice that had inspired legislative changes throughout Arizona and influenced federal policy on financial crimes. The interview process was more emotionally challenging than I'd anticipated, requiring me to revisit details of Mike's manipulation that I'd worked hard to process and move beyond. Maria's questions were thoughtful and respectful, but recounting the systematic nature of his deception brought back memories of the psychological trauma that had accompanied the financial theft. Daniel sat just outside the camera's view, providing silent support as I described how our marriage had been revealed as an elaborate criminal operation. The documentary would premiere the following spring as part of a series examining white-collar crime in America, with my case serving as an example of how victims could successfully fight back against sophisticated fraud while helping law enforcement dismantle criminal networks. The producers had interviewed Catherine Rodriguez, David Chen, Detective Morrison, and Agent Sarah Chen, creating a comprehensive narrative about the investigation and prosecution that had resulted from my decision to pursue justice aggressively. Catherine's on-camera interview provided legal perspective on how the prenuptial agreement had functioned as intended, protecting my assets while providing mechanisms for recovery and damages that had exceeded even her expectations when drafting the document. She emphasized how the morality and financial misconduct clauses had created legal leverage that had been crucial for forcing Mike's cooperation and ensuring complete asset recovery, demonstrating the importance of comprehensive legal protection in high-asset marriages. David Chen's forensic analysis had become a textbook example of how to trace hidden assets and document systematic financial crimes, with his methodology now taught in accounting programs and law enforcement training courses throughout the country. His interview detailed the sophisticated techniques Mike had used to hide assets, while explaining how careful documentation and technological investigation had ultimately revealed the complete scope of the criminal enterprise. Detective Morrison and Agent Chen provided law enforcement perspective on how my case had opened the investigation that dismantled an entire criminal network, emphasizing how victim cooperation and thorough documentation had been essential for successful prosecution. Their interviews highlighted the importance of aggressive response to financial crimes, contrasting my approach with cases where victims had chosen silence or minimal legal action that had allowed criminals to continue operating. The documentary's research had uncovered additional details about the criminal network's operations, that hadn't been revealed during the original investigation, including evidence that Mike had been recruited specifically because of his legitimate business connections and apparent success in Phoenix's real estate development community. His criminal handlers had recognized that his established reputation and professional relationships would provide access to wealthy victims who might otherwise be skeptical of romantic approaches from strangers. The psychological manipulation techniques the network had employed were revealed to be far more sophisticated than even the FBI had initially realized, with detailed training materials covering everything from personality assessment to long-term relationship management, designed to maximize financial extraction while minimizing victim suspicion. The criminals had studied psychology, sociology, and behavioral economics to develop approaches that exploited fundamental human needs for love, security, and partnership. Maria's research team had located several other victims of the criminal network who agreed to share their experiences for the documentary, creating a broader narrative about how the organization had operated across multiple states and demographic groups. The interviews revealed similar patterns of sophisticated manipulation, financial theft, and psychological trauma, demonstrating that my experience hadn't been unique but rather representative of a systematic criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of lives. The most disturbing revelation was evidence that the criminal network had maintained detailed files on potential victims throughout the Southwest, with psychological profiles, financial assessments, and strategic plans for romantic approaches that had been developed months or even years before initial contact. My file, which had been recovered during the FBI investigation, contained information about my business success, personal interests, and perceived vulnerabilities that had been gathered through social media research and professional networking. The documentary crew spent a full day filming at the various Phoenix locations that had been significant during the investigation and legal proceedings, including the courthouse where Judge Williams had presided over the divorce hearing, the bank where I'd first discovered the missing funds, and the restaurant where I'd witnessed Mike with Stephanie. Each location provided visual context for the narrative while serving as reminders of how the criminal scheme had infiltrated every aspect of my life. The filming at our current home in the Phoenix foothills provided opportunities to showcase the life Daniel and I had built together, demonstrating how recovery from criminal victimization was possible through authentic relationships, based on transparency and mutual respect. Daniel's interview emphasized how genuine partnerships differed from manipulative criminal relationships, providing viewers with guidance for recognizing healthy versus exploitative romantic dynamics. Desert Bloom Marketing's success story provided evidence that businesses could not only survive but thrive despite the personal crises that sometimes affected their leadership, with the company's growth from a startup to a regional marketing agency serving as inspiration for other entrepreneurs facing significant challenges. The documentary captured employee interviews that demonstrated how transparency and strong leadership had maintained company stability throughout the legal proceedings and media attention. The nonprofit organization I'd established to assist victims of financial fraud had grown into a statewide resource that provided legal assistance, counseling services, and advocacy support for hundreds of people each year. The documentary crew filmed at the organization's offices, interviewing staff members and clients, who described how the services had helped them navigate the complex process of fighting back against financial crimes while rebuilding their lives. The legislative changes that had resulted from the publicity surrounding my case provided evidence that individual legal victories could have broader social impact, with new Arizona laws strengthening penalties for financial fraud and improving asset protection for victims of criminal schemes. The documentary featured interviews with state legislators who had sponsored the reforms, explaining how specific cases could catalyze policy changes that protected future victims. The federal policy implications were even more significant, with the FBI's investigation of the criminal network leading to enhanced cooperation between state and federal law enforcement agencies in financial crime cases. Agent Chen's interview described how the systematic documentation from my case had influenced federal investigative procedures and victim assistance programs that were now being implemented throughout the country. The educational component of the documentary included expert interviews with psychologists, legal professionals, and law enforcement officials, who provided guidance for viewers about recognizing and responding to financial fraud in relationships. The information was designed to help potential victims identify warning signs, while encouraging aggressive legal response for those who had already been victimized by similar criminal schemes. The most powerful segment of the documentary featured a roundtable discussion with multiple victims of the criminal network, sharing their experiences and recovery processes while providing mutual support and encouragement. The conversation demonstrated how criminal victimization could be transformed into advocacy and education that helped protect others from similar harm, with my story serving as an example of how comprehensive legal action could achieve both personal justice and broader social impact. The premiere screening was held at the Phoenix Art Museum, with proceeds benefiting the Victim Assistance nonprofit and attendance by many of the legal professionals, law enforcement officials, and community leaders who had supported the investigation and prosecution. The event provided an opportunity to celebrate not just personal recovery, but the systemic changes that had resulted from refusing to accept criminal victimization passively. Catherine Rodriguez spoke at the premiere about how the case had influenced her approach to prenuptial agreements and asset protection, with the legal strategies developed for my situation now being incorporated into her practice for other high-asset clients. Her presentation emphasized how comprehensive legal preparation could provide protection that went far beyond what most people anticipated when entering marriage, potentially preventing devastating financial losses from criminal schemes. David Chen's presentation focused on the forensic accounting techniques that had been crucial for tracing hidden assets and documenting systematic financial crimes, with his methodology now being taught to other professionals throughout the forensic accounting community. His work on the case had established new standards for financial investigation that were being adopted by law enforcement agencies and private investigation firms across the country. The audience's response to the documentary was overwhelming, with many viewers expressing amazement at the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise, while praising the systematic approach to legal response that had achieved such comprehensive justice. The film's message about the importance of fighting back against financial crimes resonated with professionals and community members who recognized the broader implications for protecting vulnerable individuals from sophisticated criminal schemes. The national broadcast of the documentary generated significant media attention and public discussion about financial fraud in relationships, with my story serving as a catalyst for broader conversations about the need for financial transparency and legal protection in marriage. The response included invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and professional associations throughout the country, providing platforms for educating others about recognizing and responding to financial crimes. The book deal that resulted from the documentary's success provided another opportunity to share detailed information about fighting back against financial fraud, while encouraging other victims to pursue justice aggressively. The memoir would combine personal narrative with practical guidance for legal response, asset protection, and emotional recovery, serving as both inspiration and instruction for readers facing similar challenges. The writing process required revisiting the emotional trauma of Mike's betrayal, in even greater detail than the documentary had demanded. But the therapeutic value of transforming pain into education and advocacy made the effort meaningful and healing. Working with a professional writer who specialized in victim advocacy, the book would provide comprehensive guidance while maintaining the personal perspective that made the story relatable and inspiring. The research for the book uncovered additional information about the criminal network's operations that hadn't been revealed during the original investigation or documentary production, including evidence of international connections and more extensive victim populations than had been previously documented. The discoveries led to renewed law enforcement interest in pursuing additional prosecutions and expanding victim assistance programs. Desert Bloom Marketing's 15th anniversary celebration provided an opportunity to reflect on the company's journey, from a startup threatened by criminal activities to a regional success story that had survived and thrived despite extraordinary challenges. The milestone represented not just business achievement but personal vindication of the decision to fight back against criminal victimization, rather than accepting defeat and financial ruin. The expansion into digital marketing services for nonprofit organizations provided a way to use business success for social impact, with the company donating services to victim advocacy groups and educational organizations that worked to prevent financial crimes. The pro bono work felt like a natural extension of the advocacy that had grown from my personal experience with criminal victimization. Daniel's support throughout the documentary production, book writing, and continued advocacy work demonstrated the stability and strength of our partnership, providing daily evidence that authentic relationships based on mutual respect and transparency were possible after surviving criminal manipulation. Our marriage had now lasted 8 years, built on the kind of trust and communication that provided a stark contrast to the deception that had characterized my relationship with Mike. The college scholarship program we established for students studying criminal justice, forensic accounting, and victim advocacy provided a way to invest in the next generation of professionals who would fight financial crimes and support victims. The scholarships honored the memory of victims who hadn't survived their criminal victimization, while supporting education that could prevent future crimes and improve law enforcement response. The final interview for the documentary had been conducted at the Phoenix Memorial Garden, where a plaque honored victims of financial crimes, including those who had taken their own lives after being destroyed by criminal schemes like the one Mike had operated. Standing in that peaceful space, surrounded by desert plants that thrived despite harsh conditions, provided a powerful metaphor for survival, growth, and the transformation of trauma into positive social impact. The annual conference on financial crime prevention that grew from the documentary's success brought together law enforcement professionals, legal experts, victim advocates, and survivors from throughout the country, creating a national platform for education and policy development. My keynote presentations at these conferences emphasized how individual cases could catalyze systemic changes that protected entire communities from sophisticated criminal enterprises. The policy recommendations that emerged from the conference proceedings influenced federal legislation that strengthened penalties for romance scams and financial fraud while improving asset recovery procedures for victims. The reforms represented the broader social impact that could result from refusing to accept criminal victimization silently, demonstrating how personal justice could expand into community protection and legislative change. The sunset from our terrace continued providing daily reminders of the desert's resilience and beauty, with the changing light creating new perspectives on familiar landscapes, just as the passage of time had transformed my understanding of the criminal victimization and recovery process. The view encompassed not just natural beauty, but the growing city where I'd built a life based on authentic relationships and genuine achievements, rather than the illusions that criminals used to exploit their victims. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.